Welcome to this video, which is part of Deeper Session 5, and we're going to look at a specific verse from the Old Testament. And that Old Testament verse is found in the book of Hosea. It's Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1. Now, I'd encourage you as you go through this video, if there are some points where you want to stop it to do something, to look up something, then please do so, because the main way we're doing the deeper sessions is a kind of interactive discussion, and the discussion is often taking 40 minutes to an hour, and we're going to be looking at least half of that session in this video, but it shouldn't really be all me talking. It should be a case of doing some things too. So the first thing is to find that verse, Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1. And depending on how familiar you are with the Bible, either that's going to be easy or quite difficult. You might need to use the contents page. And just while you do that, turn the video off and come back to me, and we'll talk to you about the context, and then we'll talk about the content. So Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1. First of all, the overall context, where Hosea is in the Bible and who Hosea is. The Bible's split into, or the Old Testament rather, is split into three sections you could think of our English Old Testaments. The history section, the poetry section, and the prophets or the prophetic section, and more detail on that in the other video of session 5. If you haven't already looked there, have a look at that. So Hosea is in the prophets section. He was a prophet. God called him to speak, to listen to what God was saying, and then to speak and declare what God wanted people to know. And actually, rather extraordinary with Hosea, God called him to live a particular life that portrayed what was happening in God's relationship with his special people, Israel. And Hosea was called to marry an adulterous woman, a prostitute, in fact. And that was to be a picture of God's relationship with Israel, which so often, whereas God was always faithful, Israel was often unfaithful and often went away from God, and then God called them back. And the whole book of Hosea, these chapters that speak of various prophecies from Hosea, or even Hosea's life itself being like a prophecy, often focus on this relationship of husband to wife, and in this particular case, husband to unfaithful wife. But this chapter, Hosea 11, focuses on a different way of looking at the relationship between God and his people. And this is of a parent to a child, more specifically of a father to a son. And so God, though he doesn't use this title for himself in the Old Testament, really, God is portraying himself here as a father, and certainly he portrays himself as like a father in the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, we know that this is more clearly brought out by Jesus, as he encourages us to know our Father in heaven as he, the Son of God, knows his Father in heaven. So back to Hosea and back to the Old Testament. And in this verse, and I'll just read it, you can maybe look along with me. I'm going to read the first 4 verses of Hosea 11. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more I called Israel, the further they went from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms, but they did not realize it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. I lifted the yoke from their neck and bent down to feed them. I've read that from the New International Version. That's a slightly older version. I'm not entirely sure whether if I'd read it from the Bible Gateway version, which is the newer version of the NIV, it would have been very slightly different, possibly. But the verse we're looking at is the same. And that verse is 11, verse 1 of Hosea, and it's, "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." And our practice in these sessions of Deeper is to take a verse, to see it in its context, and to look in detail at the content of the words in the verse and what the verse means, what it meant in its original context. So here, what it meant when Hosea spoke it, and when it got written down. And only after doing that will we look at how it applies to us, because that gives us much more of a guideline of how it should apply to us, and often gives us a richer understanding of what the meaning of these words were. So we're in the latter part of the Old Testament in the prophetic books, but they look back often at what has gone on before, and they speak into the current lives of the people of Israel at the time. Now we'll take a look at the words in the verse, and as we do that, some of the things in the context will come out. So you might want to pause at this point and just have a look, and I'd encourage you to do this for a minute or two. Have a look at that single verse. Just maybe if you need to look at the other verses as well to see the context, then do that. But are there any questions that come to mind about the words in that verse, or any things that spring to mind about what that meant, as we have Hosea speaking into the lives of the people now, but looking back at the history of Israel? And that's part of why I wanted to do the other video and look at the history of Israel, because Hosea is speaking to a people who knew their history. It was their own history. It was the people that they were part of. And really, without knowing the history, we can't understand what this verse really means. But we don't have to know the detail to get the gist of it. So have a look and then pause the video maybe, and then come back and we'll talk through that. So Hosea 11 verse 1, "When Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt, I called my son." Israel. Now the word Israel can mean the person Israel, who was formerly called Jacob. He's found in Genesis, in the book of Genesis. And God took this person, Jacob, who was the grandson of Abraham, and it was through Israel that God was going to make a great nation, which he had promised to Abraham. So it could refer to the individual Israel, but as you'll see from looking at the verse in context, it means more than that. It is actually the nation that the descendants of Israel became. And that is often what the word Israel means in the Old Testament. But there is an additional complication, which means that we have to choose from one of three things. So it could be the person Israel, it could be the whole nation of the 12 tribes of Israel, which came out of the 12 sons of Israel. Or it could be after the time of Solomon, and in the reign of the first three kings of Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon, then Israel was basically a united nation. But after the time of Solomon, Israel split. Broadly speaking, the 12 tribes of Israel split into the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes. The 2 southern tribes went by the name of Judah, which was the lead tribe in a sense of that too. And the 10 northern tribes went by the name of Israel. Usually they went by the name of Israel. Occasionally, as you'll see in verse 3 of this little section that we looked at, they went by the name of Ephraim. So this is speaking to Israel. And actually the focus of Hosea's message is often to the 10 northern tribes, although he does speak to Judah as well, and he's writing in that time when the nation is split, but both the northern tribes and the southern tribes are still in their place. They're in the promised land. However, this verse, when Israel was a child, is speaking of when Israel, the 12 tribes, were together. When Israel was a child, I loved him. Often we personify nations these days, don't we, as her, but they're personified here as a him. And then the second part, which is a kind of parallel with more detail of this verse, the second part of the verse says, out of Egypt I called my son. So Israel as a nation is called out of Egypt. And this calling takes place in the Exodus. So the calling first comes to Moses as a response of the people of Israel who had gone down to Exodus towards the end of Genesis. They'd gone down as a family, a big family, but rather than being a family of tens by the time of Exodus, 400 years they've been in Egypt and they have become a great people, except they're in slavery. So they're slaves to the Egyptians, and there are over 1 million of them, around 600,000 men counted in the Exodus, and in more specifically in Numbers, a later book in that part of the Bible. And they are called out of Egypt. But the Pharaoh doesn't want to let them go, and there's a whole process that happens during the book of Exodus, and that is the way that God delivers them from slavery in Egypt to become the people that he's calling them to be. So there we have this second part of the verse, out of Egypt I called my son. So you'd think son was a singular, but it's actually the son is the nation of Israel, the people of God, the Israelites, or the Jewish people we tend to think of them as, and they are called out of Egypt. The interesting thing is here that God not only spoke to them through Moses delivered that message to the people of Israel. They didn't really believe him at first, but they also knew that they didn't have power, or they didn't believe they had power to come out of Egypt and away from their slave masters. And indeed, they wouldn't have had, apart from God delivering them through the plagues, the 10 plagues, and then making a way for them through the Red Sea. So one of the interesting things to notice about this verse, out of Egypt I called my son, is that God did indeed call them out of Egypt. And the details of that are in the book of Exodus, which is a great book to read. If you're not familiar with the Old Testament, I'd encourage you to read the book of Exodus. It is quite full on in places. There is judgment for the people in Egypt. And there's this calling of the people to come out, but also the confrontation with Pharaoh as the one in charge of Egypt, and that confrontation that takes place. And at times God hardens Pharaoh's heart, which was already set against the Israelites. I think that's important to know. But God eventually delivers the people of God from Egypt. And when we get this phrase, I called my son, it's an interesting New Testament truth that those God calls, he equips. If he calls us to do something, he gives us the means to do it. And so God, through his own equipping of his people, partly through Moses and partly through these great signs of the plagues, and through the various ways in which God led his people through the Red Sea and then through the wilderness, eventually to the promised land, which would be something that Joshua ultimately led them into. He called them and he equipped them. So when Israel was a child, that means Israel was in this fairly young stage of being formed into a nation. God said, I loved him. And actually this love continues. It continued for Israel as a child and continues on for Israel. And then out of Egypt, I called my son. So there's more that could be said of this verse, But I hope you'll see that it kind of links into the history of Israel, particularly the greatest single event in the life of Israel. I think you would probably say the Exodus. It is the event that Israel often looked back to, and often the event that the prophets looked back to, that when they wanted to say, God did this for you, the supreme thing that God did was that he brought them out of slavery in Egypt and to the Egyptians. And though God did many other great things, particularly in around the time of David and Solomon, they often looked back to this first time. So my encouragement to you is to learn the verse, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Remember that it is a verse spoken by the prophet Hosea. He's looking back on great things that God did for his people. And also when you see this verse in its immediate context, you see the kind of lament of God, that he has loved Israel faithfully, but so often Israel has, as a people, has not lived up to the calling that God had for them. And God has this ongoing lament and this ongoing willingness to deliver the people, but longing for them to wholeheartedly commit to him. And so even in this time, hundreds of years after they were delivered in the Exodus, God is still longing for them to fulfill their calling. And ultimately, we see these two things happening in the Old Testament: the sin of the people and the faithfulness of God. And ultimately, that would only be fulfilled, or the dealing with that would only be fulfilled in the Messiah that Israel started to look forward to and became one of the major subjects of the prophecies, the hope part of the prophetic books. That the Messiah would come, this special deliverer, this special rescuer would come and deliver the people of God. And as they came to understand it, they thought of it in very earthly terms, but as God would do it, it was in terms that went beyond anything that they would have ever dreamed of. And then Jesus, God's unique one and only Son, would fulfill so many things that Israel, God's people who he called his son, would never fulfill on their own apart from the Messiah. But it's important to remember that the Messiah came from Israel. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was one of the people of God, the Israelites. And so Jesus also fulfills that promise that was given to Abraham, that hopefully you'll remember from a previous session. So lots to think about from this one verse. I hope that you'll remember this verse, meditate on it, ponder it, and also think of how it applies to us as New Testament Christians now. When Israel was a child, I loved him. Well, absolutely. When we become children of God, God loved us and loves us. And out of Egypt, I called my son. God called the people of God out of slavery. Now, we've not so much been called out of a physical place and out of human slave masters, but we have been called out of slavery to sin, out of the punishment for sin and out of the power of sin over us, so we can live as people with this new freedom. We have been called to a new freedom. And remember, those God calls, he equips. So we are called to live distinctive lives, different than those around us who haven't received this calling for themselves, because of course God is looking for anyone who will turn to him and to live in this newfound freedom that he gives to us. What we can do is live in that freedom and be a signpost to others to say, there is a God who can deliver you from all those things that are holding you back. Turn to him and live in the freedom that he has for you, and come to know him as your own personal father, that you too can be his, in a sense, his son, because we all inherit, male and female, inherit the full rights of sons as they were in the Old Testament times. But you can understand yourself as a son or a daughter of the living God. So I hope this verse blesses you, and I hope these sessions of Deeper are blessing you too. until next time, which will be a review, be blessed and enjoy the blessing of God and pass it on to others.